This next game that we're looking at features a very young Aronian in 2003 facing off against Anatoly Karpov. And the opening was a Nimzo-Indian Defense. This was reached after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and now bishop to b4. This is a strategically rich and very nuanced opening. At first glance, it seems unsound, because, well, the question is Black really going to voluntarily concede the bishop pair on move 3? As we have previously discussed, in general, the two bishops advantage is significant. And so here, it looks like it's just a little bit too easy for White, right? Why not just say, challenge the bishop's position on b4 and say, okay, I call your bluff, right? You can take me, and after I take you back, I'm just going to have the bishop pair. Well, things are not so simple, and indeed a3 is not considered to be the best reaction to the Nimzo-Indian. Well, what does Black get in exchange positionally? Well, we see that White has now got doubled pawns, and also, because of b takes c3, has this isolated pawn on a3. We definitely shouldn't ignore that White will have a greater pawn mass. He's going to have these 4 pawns here along the c and the d and e files, when compared with Black's 3. However, in exchange, we can say that Black has got an extremely fast and easy development. He will be able to castle, and although White's 2 4th rank pawns afford him a space advantage in the center, the importance of the space advantage is somewhat mitigated against by the fact that a set of minor pieces has already come off the board. An additional point is that if White is not careful, he has a whole bunch of pawns on those dark squares. For example, this pawn could reach another dark square as well, and in fact, Black has a nice control over e4. And if this happens, White may find himself with a not very useful dark square bishop. These are a few of the points in favor of the Nimzo-Indian and in favor, of justifying a bishop takes c3, especially if White goes a3, because this move is considered not very useful. Whereas, of course, bishop takes c3 is part of the plan, right? One of the reasons why it's not useful is simply because when compared to a move such as knight f3, which is very commonly played here in this position, knight f3 is one of the main responses. When compared with that, it's clear that this kind of a move, placing the pawn from a2 to a3, doesn't really add much to White's position. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is that actually the pawn on a3 is in fact subtracting from White's position. He would prefer to have it on a2 for a couple of reasons. One is that the b3 square would no longer be a weakness. As we can see, this c pawn advanced, and so there was no control over b3. And now if a3 advances, there's really no control over b3. And the second reason is that on occasion, White may want to actually access this diagonal with his bishop, so he is limited in both respects. This is a gross oversimplification of what's going on with bishop takes c3, but the important point to see is that although we have one positional advantage that we generally recognize, which is the 2 bishop advantage, we have Black voluntarily conceding that. We see that it comes at a price, right? We see that in return, Black is expecting some dynamic compensation because he will have a speed of development, and he may be able to use that in some way, some kind of initiative. Another factor then, in terms of a positional advantage, is that he has, by eliminating this knight, Black is actually increasing his central control, especially over the light squares. And of course, also by exchanging a set of minor pieces, he is making White's space advantage less significant. And finally, probably the biggest point of all, as we already mentioned, is the fact that here, after b takes c3, we see a somewhat dubious pawn structure for White. So already there's a lot of questions there on move 3, but Aronian sidesteps all of these issues and instead goes for the move queen to c2, which is one of the more popular and, I suspect, more challenging responses against the Nimzo-Indian overall. Well, the point of queen c2 is that White is willing to spend a tempo in order to avoid the loss of a healthy pawn structure, right? The pawns on b2 and c3 will remain like this. So if bishop takes c3, of course, White would recapture with the queen. This is the idea. Black now changes gear and plays c5, and this partly exploits the fact that the queen is no longer on d1. This means that the pawn on d4 is undefended, and additionally, it also makes it very difficult for White to push this pawn. If, for example, in this position, Black had played the move pawn to c5, which is in fact one of the most popular moves, then the response is d5, the traditional response here, and we would enter a Benoni. However, after knight c3, bishop b4, queen c2, c5, if you were to play d5, there would be some possibility of capture, and then capture this pawn because, well, we can show this pawn takes, and knight takes, and we can see that white cannot take this knight because of the pin. So therefore, Karpov is leveraging this point against white. White has to, well, does not have to, but it is considered that white's best response is d takes c5 in this position. There's another interesting point worth mentioning. Let's say that white, for instance, were to play moves such as e3. Then here, black could actually potentially take. And what we notice is that now the c file is a semi-open file, as is the e file. But we can see that if white is not careful, black will actually be able to use the c file much more effectively than the e file. And the reason for this is that the c pawn is a little more advanced and a little more exposed than the e pawn, of course, which is extremely safe, extremely sound. And also that if a rook does plant itself on the c file, the white queen on c2 may be a little bit misplaced. So d takes c5, bishop takes c5 occurred, knight f3, normal developing moves, normal theory, castle, and now bishop to g5. One of the things about this position is that white may wish to advance this pawn to e3, depending on how black proceeds. Now in the game that didn't actually happen, but nevertheless it's usually not a bad idea to develop your bishop first before potentially locking the structure there on the dark squares, because otherwise the bishop on c1 would be a little bit more restricted, although of course it could do an eventual b3 and bishop to b2. Of course, the main point behind this move, bishop to g5, I feel, is that this pin is just kind of annoying. If, for example, black wanted to play a move such as queen c7, which may be a useful move, then at any given moment, bishop takes f6 and g takes f6 may be on the cards, right? When the issue isn't so much that black's pawn structure has been damaged, similar to how it could be damaged here with b takes c3 very, very early on in the Nimzo. I'm referring to this position after bishop takes c3. The thing is that it's a different type of damage, because to double these pawns compromises the king's safety. So anyway, after bishop to g5, bishop to e7 was seen, and this is modern chess, right? Black has only played 7 moves thus far, and his bishop has already gone first from f8 to b4, then to c5, and now to e7. So 3 out of black's total of 7 moves have been bishop moves, and the player, of course, with the black pieces is Anatoly Karpov. So he's no patzer, you know, but he's happy to break this rule of, he's flexible and willing to break the rule of one must not move, or one should not move a piece more than once in the opening. So this is modern chess. White plays rook to d1, and when I say modern chess, what I mean is modern chess is extremely concrete. So the rules are made to be broken, and there are many exceptions, and the top level players are perfectly happy to break these kind of dogmatic notions whenever a situation calls for it. And here, in the beginning, of course, bishop b4 was a normal move, part of the Nimzo-Indian, and then after white played queen c2, c5 was called for, and then of course to recapture the pawn was called for, and finally to break the pin was called for. White now goes rook d1. Notice the situation when these two pawns have been exchanged is that there has been an opening up of the d file and an opening up of the c file. In many respects, actually, it can remind one of a Sicilian defense, because in an open Sicilian you usually have the pawn going to c5, this pawn on e4, and then there is an exchange of pawns here on d4. So black would be missing the c-pawn and use the semi-open c-file. White will be missing the d-pawn and use the semi-open d-file. White now played rook d1 therefore, and immediately takes over the d-file, h6, drop the bishop back, b6, and now e4. This is the next moment that I want to comment on. We see this kind of Maroczy bind, and we see that white has a nice little space advantage. So this is quite useful for him, especially because, as we can see, all of the minor pieces remain on the board. Now, we already actually saw something similar, for those of you who remember, in the game between Wolfgang Ullmann and Lajos Portish, which I believe was the first game that we examined in this section. Black played the move bishop to b7, white now developed with bishop e2, and black played a6. Now, to understand this move, we need to see that one of the consequences of black's pawn arrangement, especially these central pawns and the absence of the c-pawn, is that these dark squares are a little bit vulnerable, a little bit weak. And in some circumstances, white may be able to exploit that with a well-timed jump with the knight to b5. Black's desire to control this square can be, again, very often seen in Sicilian positions, and here, in a sense, it's quite similar. However, can you see what one of the big drawbacks is of this move, or potential drawbacks? Well, the answer is this pawn on b6. The pawn on b6 now, in the absence of a c-pawn, was already a little bit shaky, but at least it had the a-pawn protecting it. Now, however, there is no protection for this pawn on b6. And we'll see how this actually ends up having a big influence on the game. So here we see a creation of a weakness by Karpov, of course, with a very concrete idea, which is he felt that the trade-off between the control over the b5 square versus the weakening of the b6 pawn was actually a fair trade-off. But as we'll see in the game, perhaps the decision was a bit questionable. White simply castled, and now black played knight e8. So notice how black actively seeks out the exchange of pieces. Of course, black is cramped. Notice that black's play is occurring along 3 ranks, whereas white's pieces and pawns are positioned along 4. So in the absence of space, of course, black would be very happy to allow bishop takes e7, queen takes e7. And with one less minor pieces on the board, we can see that black's harmonious development for black should be a little bit easier. Aronian rejects this and simply drops the bishop back. And this is a useful, strong diagonal for the bishop. And so we can see that the weakness of the c7 and d6 points makes it a particularly effective piece. Black now wants to develop this knight, and generally speaking, we like to develop it here via d7. And so he played the move pawn to d6. However, this is likely an error. My suspicion is that black wanted to patch up this sort of hole here on d6. And another thing that he perhaps wanted to avoid was the possibility that white would push the pawn on e5 at an opportune moment, let's say knight c6, e5, at an opportune moment to push and obtain a bind here on this d6 point, and in so doing, make the d7 pawn a backward pawn. That would make it a fixed target, and fixed targets are simply just very problematic, as we've seen in many games so far. However, besides the fact that the d7 square was desired for the knight, and there was this issue, sorry, not besides the fact, but I mean, in spite of these advantages to the move d6, it's likely an error, and we can see over the coming moves why that is. You see, white responds with this move pawn to e5, and leverages that semi-open d file. Notice how black has yet to get into any kind of a position where he can use the c file, and even if he could, the pawn on b2 can shift over to b3 and defend c4. So even this would be relatively solid. On the other hand, black's backward d6 pawn, notice how it cannot move forward. Black's backward d6 pawn has no defender besides pieces, and so now it is much more vulnerable to attack. Black plays the move queen to c7, stepping out of the d file and onto his semi-open file. E takes d6, and here the move bishop takes d6 would of course be the most desirable. If white had nothing better to do in this position than to play bishop takes d6, then black would actually be more or less okay after some kind of move like this. Maybe the knight would go to f5. Sooner or later, this knight would develop, and we could say that black's position would be perfectly fine because all of his pieces would have arrived at good squares, and this weakness would be very much under control. However, the big problem is that it fails to the beautiful move rook takes d6. The point is that after knight takes d6, the sacrificed rook is replaced by the f1 rook, rook goes to d8, and now simply queen d2. And we can see that black has no way of defending this knight, partly because of his lack of development here. He has no real good coordination. If he could teleport that rook over to maybe d7, then it would be a different story. Therefore, after e takes d6, knight takes d6 was necessary, and now Aronian played rook to d4. And well, with this move, we can see that he intends on doubling up and exploiting this pin. And well, it's interesting and I think important to note that there was a change in the open and semi-open file situation very recently. You see, in this position, we could see that black had the semi-open c file in his favor, which he never really got around to using. And white already after the move rook d1 obtained pressure along his semi-open d file, especially against this backward pawn. However, after the last move by white of e5, and then queen c7, e takes d6, knight takes d6, we see that the e pawn and the d pawn have been exchanged. As a consequence, white actually now has a semi-open file in his favor on the e file, whereas in the d file, we can now speak of an open file instead. So now this is really a very, very important file for both sides, because it is the only open file in the position, and it is a central open file at that. So rook d4 is played. Black now goes queen to c6. This move ties the knight down and prevents such a move as knight to e5, which would have been a kind of a useful strategic move, because of course knight to e5 would be a tactical disaster after queen takes g2, checkmate. Here, Aronian actually plays a very intelligent move. He plays the move bishop to d3. It's worth commenting as well that queen c6 isn't just about tying this knight down. I think the main point behind queen c6 is that black wants to be able to play the move knight to f5. So he is stepping out of this pin, and now if he can play the move knight f5, there will not be this kind of easy target on d6. And also additionally, by hitting both forking the bishop and rook, he will be able to pick up the bishop pair and exchange a set of minor pieces. All very good things from black's perspective. Aronian's response is a very, very intelligent move, in my opinion, bishop to d3. And with this move, what is happening is that not only is knight f5 parried, but also knight to d7 is not an option, remains unplayable. The reason for this is that after bishop takes d6, white will simply go bishop to e4. Now this will actually hit the queen and the bishop, so the queen should step back. And now after bishop takes b7, we see the problem. We see that the queen is overloaded. If she captures white's light squared bishop, then black, Karpov in this case, will lose his bishop on d6. So therefore, there are some very serious problems being created by Aronian. On the one hand, he is preventing knight f5, a very strategically desirable move. And on the other, he's preventing knight d7, which is also strategically desirable because one move is seeking to complete development. The other move is seeking to ease the piece pressure and remove this target from the open file. Owing to that fact, black actually decided, okay, let's remove the target anyway. But Karpov's selection of squares is extremely limited, so he chooses the move knight to e8. Now, after this move, we will finally see one of the big drawbacks of this earlier pawn push b6. It may seem like the two are not connected, but let's see. Well, white starts with this move bishop h7 check. A rather strange looking move because it's a simple check, so the king can just step back. But actually it's a very common idea in chess, which is that sometimes just giving the check before your actual and, purposeful move, which is bishop to e4, this is sort of the final objective, to hit the queen and the bishop. To give the check first is a smart idea because the king on h8, in some situations, or on h1, if you're doing this with black, bishop to h2 check, in many situations the king will actually stand worse on h8 for a couple of reasons. One is that the king here is susceptible to checks, right? So if, for example, there's a knight e5 at some point in the future, then f7 and g6 will come in with check. Another reason is that f7 itself may actually be lacking protection, right? Either less protection in the case that the rook that is on f8, or suddenly it can become an undefended target if this rook had already moved. These are some of the benefits. And finally, even, if we, let's say, were to eventually end up in an endgame, the king on h8 is typically worse than on g8 because it's further away from the center, and the centralization of the king and activation of the king is very important in endgames. Returning to the actual middle game scenario here facing black, the queen is under fire and queen c8 is the only move. Notice that black's limit of squares is in part a function of white's space advantage. We see that white continues to be playing here along 4 ranks, whereas black's entire army is still set up along 3 ranks. And we also have some lack of coordination here of this knight on e8, a lot of pieces on the last rank. White now plays knight to a4, and hits that weakness, seeking to exploit the b6 weakness, and, well, there's not much that black can actually do. The reason for this is that the black queen cannot return to c7, and were you to play a move such as bishop to d8, this would defend the pawn, but once again, the black queen would be overloaded. It's defending two pieces, so after bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, the bishop on d8 would fall. Well, the other question, of course, is why not knight d7? Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to figure this one out for yourself. Well, okay, so I shall show the answer now. Bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, and now very typical tactic. Rook takes d7, queen takes d7, and knight takes b6. The point is that white is only temporarily down in exchange, but after the queen moves, white will pick up the exchange back, and that b6 pawn will have been for free. So extra pawn and 3 versus 1 majority on the queen side would mean an entirely hopeless position. Therefore, Karpov was forced to make a rather sad concession. He played the move bishop to c5. Karpov was forced to play this in order to avoid material losses. However, after knight takes c5, we see that black has lost the bishop pair. I do want to add another thing, which is that bishop takes e4, for example, would not save black, because after queen takes e4, black still would not have access to any squares. And although bishop d8 would now be possible in the sense that there's no overloading of the queen, the problem is that after queen takes e4, we see that this rook is under fire. So the only way to avoid material losses was indeed played by Karpov bishop c5, but after knight takes c5, not only has white collected the bishop pair, but queen takes c5 is still not possible because of bishop takes b7, so therefore b takes c5 would be necessary. Now bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, rook to d2. The dust has settled, but we see that the situation has become quite bad for black. We see that the actual weakening here of that b6 point earlier on with the move a6 led, in this particular situation, led to severe concrete problems after knight a4, and that sort of forced black's hand to play bishop c5, and after bishop c5, black lost the bishop pair and also ended up with a worse pawn structure. Note this isolated pawn on c5. It's also worth commenting on that the isolated pawn on c5 is on a dark square, and we have, in this case, we're looking at it from the white perspective. Okay, I should say Aronian had the dark squared bishop, so this is especially fragile as a result. Black played knight f6 in order to try to complete his development, get his pieces off the back rank, and white now played rook f to d1. Here, it seems that knight b to d7, completing the development, was likely best, but I suspect Karpov didn't really fancy the position arising after knight e5. Knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. There's a lot of pressure here, as well as bishop d6 ideas in the air. And here queen e4, probably best. Queen takes e4, best. Knight takes, and rook d7. We can see why a technical player, a grinder like Karpov, would shy away from such a position, especially because he was known, and we've seen it, as being merciless in such positions from the white side. What do I mean by that? Well, in this position, we can see that there are several positional imbalances in play. When we speak of pawn structures, we can see that white has the upper hand. He has only 2 pawn islands versus black's 3 pawn islands. Additionally, we can see that black has 2 isolated pawns, so the structure is bad in multiple respects. We can also see that white has an extremely powerful bishop here on a board where there is play along both sides, and therefore the bishop is generally going to be stronger than the knight. We can see that the knight's strength is really very unimpressive in this particular instance, because although it is centralized, we want a knight to not just be centralized, we also want it to be stable. And in this case, white can at any given moment play f3 and force the knight back away from its central post. Finally, there is not just structures and minor piece play, but we can also comment on open and semi-open files. And in this particular case, there's only one open file in the position, and we can see that white is dominating it. So all in all, there are a lot of imbalances in white's favor, and it's understandable that black would have wanted to avoid this. Therefore, black instead chose to move queen to c8, which prevents some rook d8 ideas. However, This is just losing after bishop d6. Now the rook is hit, rook e8, and now knight e5. And we actually see the effect that bishop h7 check before dropping back to e4 actually had. That knight e5 is now coming in with tempo. If only black had the king on g8, then this would not be a concern. In fact, as things stand, black was forced to play king g8 himself just in order to defend the pawn. And now Aronian's talent really shines through. He has, in my view so far, beautifully interwoven powerful strategic play with graceful tactical shots. So with his next move, he really shows this: bishop to e7. The point of this move is that the bishop is taboo. It cannot be captured, since capturing it would lead to rook d8 check. And we see that black is losing his queen. And, well, if you cannot do that, the threat is simply to capture this knight and devastate the black kingside position, or even better, to play rook d8 and then capture. And we can see that black is actually going to have severe problems on the back rank. Black does not actually have any moves such as knight to d7. So he chose to move queen to c7 just to step off the last rank. However, the problem is after bishop takes f6, g takes f6, black's pawns have now been doubled. And the problem is similar to what we were talking about much earlier in the game when I said that it's not the same to have your pawns doubled in an Nimzo-Indian defense here with, bishop takes c3 and b takes c3, to have them doubled on the queen side as to have them doubled on the king side. Because on the king side, it's going to typically have concrete consequences for your king. And we can see that here, the g file has now become a semi-open file. And in this case, it's not black who will be able to benefit from the g file. Instead, it's rather going to be white, because white should be able to get there and black's king is going to be too exposed. Notice that in this position, black's rooks continue to be uncoordinated, and Aronian exploits this with the move queen e4. So that strikes at the rook, and therefore black has to move the rook rather than take the knight, and now knight to g4. Such a move as f5 is not going to scare Aronian, who in this position would presumably have given the check on f6. And if you play king g7, whereupon black is actually attacking two pieces at once, we see that knight takes e8 is coming in with check, picking up a rook and hitting the queen as well. So after knight g4, Karpov played king g7. Aronian simply went queen e3, targeting the pawn on h6 and with it checkmate. So for example, knight c6, queen takes h6, king here, knight takes f6 is mate. So rook h8 was necessary, but when we have only a single rook holding up this particular point here of attack on h6, we can use deflection tactics. And here Aronian played the very nice move, rook d8, basically forcing this rook to come off the board, and with it, the black king will lose its only defender and get checkmated. And so with that, Karpov resigned, and a very, very impressive victory for the then very young Levon Aronian. This game, to my mind, I mean, besides showing Aronian's just tremendous understanding of chess and tactical acuity, it also showed a lot of different positional themes in play. Especially we saw, for example, in this position here, we saw the creation of two semi-open files. Then later on, we saw here after this move e4, we saw the space. Prior in the variations that didn't actually take place in the game with bishop takes d3, we had actually discussed a lot of different structural issues, double pawns on the c file, an isolated a pawn, and so on and so forth. We then saw here with the move a6, the voluntary creation of a weakness by black here, this pawn on b6, so return to the discussion of structure. And well, we eventually saw the very nasty consequences of that move. We saw such moves, we discussed such moves as knight to e8 and bishop to g3, just in light of the space advantage. And then we also talked a bunch about backward pawns and how they tie into the semi-open d file. And of course, this concrete move being a mistake. Here we see a change from a semi-open file to a fully open d file, and some tactical points as well mixed in at the same time. Here, for example, if bishop takes d6, we saw rook takes d6 would be devastating. So that's why black had to make the not so desirable move knight takes d6. Then we even saw some subtle points, like, for example, here bishop to d3, a very intelligent move. And then bishop h7 check. Really, really a nice finesse, forcing the king over to h8. And we saw how that actually had very concrete consequences later on down the line with this point on f7. Here in this position, after bishop e4, queen went to c8. It looks as though white is going for an exchange of pieces, which, as I said, generally wouldn't be ideal. Not fatal or not so problematic to exchange a single set of pieces. You know, you can still leverage that space advantage. But actually here there was something much more concrete, which was that knight a4 move, that exploitation of the weakness, after which black's position was already pretty much falling apart. And then, in fact, we saw Karpov having to play bishop to c5, whereupon white captured on c5. B takes c5 was the sad necessity. And here we saw how Aronian made short work of the poor structure that black was left with, even though, as it turns out, white's two bishop advantage was very temporary, because here white actually captured on b7. Although I didn't at the time mention that rook to d2 seems to me to be a little bit better, since here, if black himself wishes to exchange off one of white's bishops, then white would actually step in with his queen already to a very central post. So not sure what exactly Aronian's thinking was there, but we shouldn't question Aronian's play too much, because, okay, after rook d2, knight f6, rook fd1, he had a whole bunch of assets in his favor, better structure. The bishop and knight, nevertheless, is better than two knights, and also the control of the only open file with a doubled up rooks. And this proved to be too much for Karpov, who immediately erred with queen c8, after which the position was pretty much lost. So a really, really instructive game, I think, encompassing pretty much all of the different positional topics that we've discussed to date. And that brings us to a close for game 4. We have only 2 remaining games, which are very, very modern games. One played in 2007 between Dmitry Yakovenko and Magnus Carlsen. That'll be the next game that we look at. And finally, we have a game between Wang Hao and Fabiano Caruana. So I look forward to seeing you guys in the next game. So see you there.